Most men don't fail with women because they're unattractive. They fail because they were trained to behave in a way that quietly erases them. Yesterday, I watched a man at a coffee shop for 47 minutes. He was young, well-dressed, polite. He said all the right things at exactly the wrong moments. He smiled when he should have paused. He agreed when he should have stood still. He tried to impress when nothing was being asked of him. And the entire time he believed he was doing everything right. By the end of the conversation, she was already gone. Not physically, psychologically. That man wasn't unlucky. He wasn't inexperienced. He was invisible. And if you've ever been ghosted after a great conversation, if you've ever done everything right and still lost to someone who seemed to care less, this story is about you. What I'm going to explain today isn't comfortable. Most men understand it intellectually and still refuse to change. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and your local time. And if you value honest conversations about psychology and attraction, consider subscribing. I want to start with a question that most men avoid answering honestly. How many times have you walked away from a conversation with a woman thinking that went well, only to never hear from her again? How many times have you replayed every sentence in your head, searching for the mistake only to conclude that nothing went wrong? You were polite. You listened. You showed interest without being crude. You followed every rule you were taught. And still, she disappeared. At some point, you probably told yourself a story to protect your ego. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe she met someone else. Maybe it was just bad timing. That explanation feels comforting because it removes responsibility. It turns rejection into randomness. Bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. That story is false. What you're experiencing isn't chance. It isn't mystery. And it isn't cruelty. It's pattern. And patterns don't come from luck. They come from structure, from rules, from systems operating exactly as designed. Men don't struggle with women because women are confusing. Men struggle because they're using the wrong operating system to solve the wrong problem. Let me be very precise here. Attraction is not a moral reward. It's not given out for effort, kindness, or intention. It doesn't care how hard you tried or how respectful you were. Attraction responds to emotional signals, not logical ones. And when you approach it like a checklist, you break it. This is where most men get stuck. They assume that if something doesn't work, they simply need to do more of it. More attention, more compliments, more availability, more reassurance, more effort. They double down on the very behavior that's causing the problem. And when it still fails, they feel betrayed. But nothing betrayed you. You were never playing the right game. Think about how men usually describe these situations. We had such a deep conversation. She said she liked nice guys. She told me I was different. She said she wasn't ready for a relationship. Those statements sound meaningful. They sound personal. But they all share one thing in common. They focus entirely on words, not behavior, not outcomes. Words. Attraction doesn't live in words. It lives in emotional movement, in tension, in uncertainty, in polarity. When those things are missing, no amount of talking can save you. This is why so many men are shocked by rejection. From their perspective, everything made sense. They followed the script. They were calm, supportive, agreeable. They removed all friction. They made the interaction safe. And that's the problem. Safety is not attraction. Comfort is not desire. And predictability is not connection. When you remove all emotional risk, you remove all emotional reward. Most men don't realize this because they confuse attraction with approval. Approval feels good. It feels like progress. She's smiling, she's talking, she's opening up. So you assume you're winning. But approval and attraction are not the same thing. Approval is passive. Attraction is active. Approval says you're acceptable. Attraction says, I want you. Those are very different psychological states. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Many women enjoy conversations with men they are not attracted to. They enjoy the attention, the validation, the emotional safety. That doesn't make them bad people. It makes them human. But when a man mistakes comfort for desire, he walks straight into disappointment. This is why ghosting hurts so deeply. It feels sudden, unexplained, cruel. But from her side, it wasn't sudden at all. The decision was made quietly long before the silence. The silence was just the cleanest exit. And the reason it keeps happening to the same men is simple. They are consistent. Consistently agreeable. Consistently available. Consistently predictable. They behave in a way that produces the same emotional result every time. You could put 100 different women in front of them. The outcome would barely change. That's when men start asking the wrong question. What's wrong with women today? What do women really want? Why do jerks always win? Those questions miss the point. The issue isn't women. It's the mental framework you're operating from. Imagine trying to run Windows software on a Mac. It doesn't matter how advanced the program is. It doesn't matter how much effort you put into installing it. The system isn't compatible. The result will always be failure. That's what's happening in your interactions. You're using logic where emotion is required. You're using compliance where tension is needed. You're using performance where presence matters. And because you've been taught that being good should work, the failure feels personal. It isn't. The rules you were given were never about attraction. They were about behavior, about social harmony, about being liked. No one taught you how desire actually forms, because that topic makes people uncomfortable. It doesn't sound polite. It doesn't fit neatly into moral lessons. So instead, you were handed a simplified story. Be nice. Be respectful. Be patient. Be consistent. And when that story fails, you blame yourself for not being good enough at it. The truth is harder to swallow. You were good at the wrong thing. And here's where it gets even more difficult. Every man believes he's the exception. He hears this and immediately thinks, but my situation is different. I'm funny. I have a good job. I'm emotionally intelligent. I dress well. None of that matters if the core signal you're sending is the same. Attraction doesn't respond to credentials. It responds to energy, to self-possession, to emotional independence, to a man who is not seeking permission to exist in her presence. When a woman feels that a man needs her approval to feel okay, something inside her closes. Unconsciously, instinctively. She may still be kind. She may still talk. But desire doesn't grow there. This is why rejection often comes with confusion instead of conflict. There's nothing to argue about. Nothing went wrong on the surface. The interaction simply didn't create the internal conditions required for attraction. And if you don't understand that, you'll keep repeating the same cycle. Hope, effort, confusion, silence. Breaking that cycle doesn't start with new techniques. It starts with recognizing that what you've been taught to value in these interactions is fundamentally misaligned with how attraction actually works. That realization is uncomfortable. It threatens your identity as a good guy. It forces you to admit that effort and intention are not guarantees, and that's why most men resist it. But once you see the pattern clearly, you stop taking rejection personally. You stop moralizing it. You stop chasing explanations that don't exist. You begin to understand that this isn't about being better. It's about being different in the only way that actually matters. I remember the first time this contradiction became impossible to ignore. I was 20 years old, standing at a crowded house party somewhere off campus. Loud music, cheap beer. Too many people pretending they were more confident than they felt. I had done what I always did back then. I dressed carefully, clean shirt, good shoes. I made sure my posture was right. I smiled at the right moments. I waited for the correct opening before speaking. I believed preparation mattered. Across the room was my friend Alex. If I'm being honest, there was nothing impressive about him on paper. He wasn't handsome in a conventional way. He didn't have money. He didn't dress well. His clothes looked like they had been grabbed without thought, maybe without mirrors. There was no polish to him, no effort to signal status. And yet 3 women were standing close to him. Not politely, not accidentally. They were engaged, competing, laughing a little too loudly, leaning in, touching his arm as if it belonged to them. I watched this for a long time. At first I assumed I was missing something. Maybe Alex had some hidden advantage I didn't know about. Maybe he was telling incredible stories. Maybe he had connections. Maybe there was context I wasn't seeing. So I paid attention. What I saw confused me. Alex wasn't trying. He wasn't impressing. He wasn't filtering himself. He wasn't scanning their faces for approval. He spoke when he felt like it. He disagreed without softening his tone. He walked away mid-conversation to grab a drink without explaining himself. When one woman tried to dominate the interaction, he ignored her and continued talking to someone else. Nothing about his behavior suggested strategy. There was no calculation, no visible desire to be chosen. And that was the moment something cracked inside me. Because everything I had been taught said this shouldn't be happening. According to the rules I followed, Alex was doing it wrong. He wasn't polite enough. He wasn't accommodating. He wasn't careful. He wasn't grateful for the attention. By every logical measure, I should have been the one surrounded. Instead, I was invisible. I stood there holding a drink I didn't want, watching a reality that didn't match the story I had built my identity around. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question. What if the things I thought mattered didn't that night? I didn't confront Alex. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't try to copy him. I just observed, quietly, objectively. And the more I watched, the clearer the pattern became. Alex was not reacting to the women. He wasn't adjusting himself to fit their expectations. He wasn't offering himself up to be evaluated. He was moving through the interaction as if his internal state mattered more than theirs. He had his own rhythm, his own pace, his own center. I didn't have that. I was calibrated entirely around response, around feedback, around approval. Every sentence I spoke was shaped by a question I wasn't aware I was asking. Is this okay? Alex wasn't asking that question. That realization didn't feel empowering. It felt humiliating. Because once you see the difference, you can't pretend you don't. I had to admit something that threatened the image I had of myself. I wasn't being rejected because I lacked value. I was being rejected because I was communicating that I didn't believe I had value unless someone else confirmed it. And people respond to that belief, whether they can articulate it or not. I went home that night, unsettled. Not angry, not jealous. Just deeply uncomfortable. The kind of discomfort that doesn't fade when you distract yourself. The kind that lingers. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the same pattern everywhere. Different settings, different women, different men. Same outcome, The men who were the most polite, the most careful, the most accommodating, were rarely the ones generating interest. They were liked, appreciated, trusted, but not desired. The men who were desired were not necessarily impressive, but they were grounded, self-directed, emotionally independent. This didn't fit the moral framework I had inherited. I had been taught that attraction should reward effort, that showing how much you care should count for something, that consistency and reliability were inherently attractive traits. Those things matter in relationships. They matter in friendships. They matter in work. But attraction happens before all of that, and it follows different rules. What disturbed me most wasn't that Alex was successful. It was that he wasn't doing anything special. He wasn't performing masculinity. He wasn't playing a role. He wasn't trying to dominate or impress. He simply wasn't seeking permission. I began to see my own behavior more clearly. How I waited, how I softened my opinions, how I laughed a little too eagerly, how I avoided disagreement even when I felt it, how I filled silence out of nervousness instead of letting it exist. All of it came from the same place. Fear. Fear of being disliked. Fear of being rejected. Fear of losing the interaction. And that fear leaked into everything. Attraction doesn't grow in the presence of fear. Not that kind. The fear of loss, the fear of disapproval, the fear of not being enough. That fear makes you small. It makes you reactive. It makes you transparent. In the worst way, women sense it immediately. Not because they're analyzing you, but because humans are wired to read emotional posture. And the posture of a man who is trying not to be rejected is fundamentally unappealing. That was the conclusion I resisted the longest. I wanted the problem to be something external, something fixable with technique. Better lines, better timing, better presentation. But the problem wasn't external, it was structural. The way I had been taught to approach women was based on compliance, not polarity. On approval, not presence. On being chosen, not choosing. Alex wasn't special. He was simply unburdened by the need to be validated in that moment. And that freedom created space. Space for curiosity. Space for tension. Space for attraction. I didn't know how to access that freedom yet. I just knew I didn't have it. And that knowledge changed the way I saw myself. For the first time, I stopped asking why women didn't respond to me the way I wanted. I started asking a more honest question. What am I actually communicating about myself before I even speak? That question stayed with me. It followed me into every interaction, every silence, every rejection. It didn't make things easier immediately. In some ways, it made them harder. Because once you see the pattern, you can't hide behind confusion anymore. You either change the structure, or you accept the outcome. The longer I sat with that realization, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Women were not responding to who I thought I was. They were responding to what my behavior communicated beneath the surface. And what it communicated wasn't confidence depth or strength. It communicated hunger. Not physical hunger, emotional hunger. The quiet kind that tries to hide itself behind politeness. That's when another belief collapsed. For years, I had assumed attraction worked like a resume. You list your strengths. You minimize your flaws. You present yourself as a good option. If the other person is reasonable, they should see the value. That assumption is logical. It's also completely wrong. Attraction is not a reward for merit. It doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't respond to intention. It responds to emotional signals that bypass conscious thought. Signals that say, this person is centered, or this person needs something from me. The difference between those two signals is everything. This is why so many men are confused by their own experiences. They do everything right and still fail. Meanwhile, someone who seems careless succeeds. From the outside, it looks unjust. From the inside, it feels humiliating. But nothing unfair is happening. What's happening is inverse mathematics. The more you want a specific outcome, the more your behavior bends toward securing it. And the more it bends, the more you lose the very quality that makes attraction possible. Independence, emotional self-sufficiency, internal gravity. This is the part most men resist because it sounds backward. We're taught that effort creates results, that caring more leads to better outcomes, that wanting something badly is proof of sincerity. In attraction, sincerity is irrelevant if it's paired with need. When a woman feels that a man wants her more than he wants to be himself, something in her pulls away. Not out of cruelty, out of instinct. Because neediness signals instability. And instability is not something the nervous system relaxes around. Men try to argue with this point. They say it shouldn't be that way, that women should appreciate effort, that this dynamic is shallow or unfair. That argument doesn't change reality. Attraction is not a debate, it's a reaction. The more I observed, the clearer it became. Men who failed repeatedly were not unattractive. They were overinvested, over-accommodating, over-eager. They tried to remove all friction from interactions, thinking that comfort would lead to closeness. But closeness without tension feels flat. This is where most men make a critical error. They confuse peace with connection. They believe that if they create a calm, agreeable environment, attraction will naturally follow. They don't realize that desire is built on contrast, on push and pull, on the presence of something that could be lost. When nothing is at stake, nothing is felt. I started noticing how often men rushed to release tension. A woman would challenge them, and they would immediately soften. A woman would tease them, and they would laugh it off. A woman would go quiet, and they would fill the silence. All of those behaviors come from the same place: anxiety. Anxiety that the moment might collapse if not managed. Anxiety that discomfort equals failure. Anxiety that if the interaction isn't constantly smooth, something is wrong. But smoothness is not attraction. Smoothness is neutrality. Think about the last movie that truly held your attention. There was conflict, uncertainty, moments of discomfort. Without those elements, the story would have been forgettable. Human psychology works the same way in relationships. This doesn't mean creating drama. It means allowing emotional movement, allowing disagreement, allowing pauses, allowing the possibility that the interaction might not continue. Most men are terrified of that possibility. They treat every interaction like a fragile object that must be protected at all costs. And in doing so, they suffocate it. I saw myself in all of this. The way I monitored reactions, the way I adjusted tone, the way I prioritized being liked over being honest. I wasn't present, I was performing. And performance is exhausting. It also communicates something very specific. It says, I need this to go well. And when a woman feels that pressure even subtly, her interest drops. Not because she dislikes you, but because the dynamic becomes unbalanced. Attraction requires polarity. Polarity requires difference. Difference requires the willingness to stand apart. That was the piece I was missing. I wasn't standing anywhere. I was leaning. Leaning toward approval, leaning toward reassurance, leaning toward validation. And when you lean, you lose your center. This is why logical explanations don't help most men. They understand the concepts, but can't change the behavior. Because the behavior isn't coming from conscious thought. It's coming from a deep program installed early in life. Be good, be agreeable, be liked. Don't cause trouble. Don't upset people. Don't risk rejection. Those rules make you socially acceptable. They do not make you attractive. And the more tightly you cling to them, the more frustrated you become. Because you're doing what you were told, and the result doesn't match the promise. At some point, you have to stop asking why it doesn't work and start asking what the rules actually are. That's when another realization hit me. Attraction is not built by adding things. It's built by subtracting them. Subtracting your need to be approved. Subtracting your constant availability. Subtracting your predictability. Subtracting the urgency to secure an outcome. Most men are adding more messages, more compliments, more explanations, more effort. They think attraction grows through accumulation. It doesn't. It grows in the empty space you leave behind. When you don't immediately respond. When you don't over-explain. When you don't agree just to keep things smooth. When you don't stay where you're not genuinely engaged. That space creates tension, and tension creates interest. This isn't manipulation, it's alignment. It's acting from a place where your internal state matters more than the result, where you're not trying to be chosen because you're already choosing yourself. That shift is subtle, but it's decisive. Once I understood this, I stopped asking how to impress women. I started asking something far more uncomfortable. What would my behavior look like if I genuinely didn't need this to work? That question exposed everything. It exposed how often I was chasing outcomes instead of expressing myself. How often I was speaking for effect instead of truth. How often I was trying to secure something instead of experiencing it. And it forced me to confront the fact that my struggle wasn't about women at all. It was about identity. I had built my sense of worth on external response, on being seen as good, desirable, acceptable. And as long as that was true, attraction would always feel just out of reach. Because desire doesn't move toward need. It moves toward groundedness, toward presence, toward a man who is not trying to earn permission to exist. Once I understood that the problem wasn't effort, but orientation, I started tracing it backward. I wanted to know where this behavior came from, not just in me, but in almost every man I knew. The answer was uncomfortable because it was familiar. The program didn't start in adulthood. It didn't start with dating apps or bad advice online. It started early, quietly, repeatedly. It started when we were children. I call it the good boy protocol. It's installed before you have the language to question it. Before you understand attraction. Before you have any real experience with women at all. Be nice to girls. Don't upset them. Respect women. Make them feel safe. Happy wife, happy life. On the surface, none of this sounds wrong. In many contexts, it isn't wrong. These are rules designed to create social order, to reduce conflict, to keep things predictable. But none of them have anything to do with desire. The mistake isn't that these lessons exist. The mistake is that men confuse them with attraction. They believe that the behaviors that make them acceptable will also make them wanted. They won't. Attraction doesn't respond to obedience. It responds to polarity. And polarity requires tension. Difference. A sense of separation between two individuals who are not trying to merge immediately. The good boy protocol does the opposite. It teaches you to collapse yourself toward approval, to smooth edges, to avoid friction, to prioritize her emotional comfort over your internal truth. And when you do that consistently, you don't become attractive. You become familiar, safe, predictable. I started seeing this pattern everywhere. Men who approached women like golden retrievers, loyal, eager, well-meaning, entirely focused on pleasing, always waiting for direction. And women were not looking for that energy. They weren't looking for chaos or cruelty either. That's a misunderstanding that leads men in the wrong direction. They weren't looking for aggression. They weren't looking for dominance. They were looking for self-sufficiency, for a man who didn't need constant reassurance, who didn't reorganize his identity the moment someone attractive entered the room, who could stand alone without becoming defensive or withdrawn. That's when the wolf analogy finally made sense to me. Not a violent wolf, not a reckless one, but a solitary animal that moves with intention, that doesn't chase everything that moves, that doesn't beg for attention, that doesn't need approval to exist. Independence, unpredictability, internal authority. Those traits create polarity naturally. The good boy protocol destroys them. It teaches men to avoid risk, to avoid saying the wrong thing, to avoid discomfort, to avoid rejection at all costs. And in doing so, it removes the very conditions where attraction can grow. Most men don't realize they're running this program. They think it's just their personality. They say things like, "That's just who I am," or "I'm not like those guys." But behavior isn't personality. It's conditioning, and conditioning can be changed. What makes this difficult is that the good boy protocol is rewarded in other areas of life. At work, being agreeable helps. In school, following rules helps. In friendships, being supportive helps. So when it fails in attraction, men assume they just need to try harder, be even nicer, even more understanding, even more patient. That only deepens the problem. Because the issue isn't kindness, it's orientation. You can be kind and still grounded, respectful and still firm, attentive and still independent. But the good boy protocol doesn't teach balance. It teaches submission disguised as morality. I saw this clearly when I started paying attention to moments of tension. Every interaction with a woman contains what I call polarity points. These are moments where emotional energy either rises or collapses, where something is at stake, where difference is revealed. Most men panic at these moments. A woman challenges them and they immediately agree. A woman disagrees and they soften their stance. A woman pulls back and they chase. A woman tests and they fold. Not because they want to, because they're afraid of losing approval. They treat tension like a threat instead of a resource. But tension is not the enemy. Tension is the signal that two separate identities are interacting, that there is difference, that there is movement. When you remove tension, you remove polarity. And without polarity, attraction collapses. I had spent years doing exactly that. Releasing tension the moment it appeared, making jokes, explaining myself, apologizing for opinions I actually believed. Anything to restore comfort. And every time I did, I felt a subtle loss of respect in the interaction. Not spoken, not dramatic, just a shift. The conversation would continue, but the energy would flatten. Interest would fade, and eventually, so would she. This wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. Comfort is valuable in relationships that already exist. It is not what creates attraction in the first place. Think about it this way. When was the last time you felt excited by something completely predictable? When was the last time a story with no conflict held your attention? It doesn't happen. The nervous system doesn't engage when there's nothing at risk. Most men approach women like instruction manuals. Clear, polite, step by step. Page 1, I like you. Page 2, I'm reliable. Page 3, I'll adapt to you. Page 4, please choose me. There's no mystery there. No tension, no movement, just availability. And what is always available has no value. That's the part that hurts men the most, because they confuse availability with commitment. They believe showing up fully from the beginning proves seriousness. What it actually proves is that you have nothing else competing for your attention. And that communicates low internal value, whether you intend it or not. I had to confront the fact that my fear of tension was a fear of losing. And that fear was guiding my behavior far more than any conscious decision. The good boy protocol doesn't make you evil. It makes you invisible. And once you see that clearly, you're faced with a choice. You can continue operating from a place of fear, smoothing everything, chasing comfort, hoping that one day the effort will be enough. Or you can start tolerating tension, allowing disagreement, standing in your own frame without apologizing for it, letting interactions rise or fall without trying to control the outcome. That second path feels dangerous at first because it risks rejection, it risks silence, it risks walking away without certainty. But it also restores something essential, your center. And without that attraction, we'll never stabilize. This isn't about becoming colder. It's about becoming solid. It's about no longer needing every interaction to validate you. The good boy protocol taught you to avoid loss. Attraction requires the willingness to accept it. Once I stopped treating tension as something to eliminate, I began to see how deeply most men fear it. Tension is misunderstood. Men hear the word and think of conflict arguments, rejection. They assume tension means something is going wrong. That assumption shapes their behavior in ways they don't even notice. But tension is simply emotional charge. It's the space between two people where something could happen or not. It's uncertainty. And uncertainty is what keeps the nervous system awake. Every interaction with a woman contains moments where that charge appears. I call them polarity points. They're subtle, but decisive. And what you do in those moments determines whether attraction rises or collapses. A polarity point might look like a challenge. She disagrees with you. She questions your opinion. She pushes back lightly or directly. Another might look like withdrawal. She goes quiet. She leans back. She stops investing for a moment. Another might be a test. A comment meant to see if you'll fold over, explain, or seek approval. Most men respond the same way. They rush to neutralize the moment. If she challenges them, they soften their position. Yeah, you're probably right. If she pulls back, they chase. More questions, more reassurance. If she tests them, they try to pass by pleasing her. All of these responses have one thing in common. They collapse polarity. They say, I need this to feel smooth. They say, I can't tolerate uncertainty. They say, please don't take your attention away from me. And women feel that instantly, not as a conscious judgment, as a shift in energy. When a man releases tension, the moment it appears, he communicates that he is uncomfortable standing alone, that he needs the interaction to stay warm and safe, that his internal state depends on her reaction. Attraction doesn't survive there. Think about it carefully. When was the last time you felt drawn towards someone who immediately gave you everything you wanted? No resistance, no edge, no pause, just agreement and availability. It feels pleasant at first, then it feels empty, because there's nothing to lean into. Tension is what gives attraction shape. Without it, everything goes flat. This is why so many men end up confused. They believe they're doing the right thing by making interactions easy, by avoiding discomfort, by keeping things light and agreeable. They think they're creating a positive experience. What they're actually creating is neutrality. And neutrality is where attraction goes to die. I had to confront how deeply this fear of tension ran in me. I realized how often I filled silence just to avoid the discomfort of not knowing what would happen next. How often I laughed at things I didn't find funny. How often I adjusted my opinions mid-sentence when I sensed resistance. All of that came from the same place, from the belief that tension equals danger. That belief isn't natural, it's learned. From childhood, we're taught that conflict is bad, that disagreement leads to rejection, that harmony must be preserved at all costs. Those lessons are useful in some contexts. They're destructive in attraction. Attraction requires the presence of two separate individuals, two centers, two perspectives that don't immediately merge. When you remove difference, you remove polarity. I started experimenting with this cautiously at first, not with techniques, but with restraint. I stopped rushing to smooth things over. If a woman disagreed with me, I didn't argue aggressively. I didn't persuade. I simply held my position, calmly, without justification. If she went quiet, I didn't fill the space. I let the silence exist. I watched what happened when I didn't rescue the moment. If she teased me, I didn't explain myself. I didn't defend. I let it pass, or I returned it lightly. The result was unsettling. The interactions became less predictable. Sometimes they ended faster. Sometimes they deepened. Sometimes they turned sharp. Sometimes they turned playful. But they were no longer flat. Something was at stake. And that's when I understood why men avoid tension. Because tension introduces the possibility of loss, and most men are far more afraid of loss than they are motivated by attraction. They would rather have a guaranteed mediocre interaction than risk a charged one that might fail. So they choose comfort. They choose safety. They choose invisibility. Women don't experience this as men being nice. They experience it as men being emotionally ungrounded, reactive, overinvested, and that triggers distance. This is where many men misinterpret what they see. They notice that women seem drawn to men who are less accommodating, less available, less predictable, and they jump to the wrong conclusion. They think women like bad boys. That's not true. Women like men who are not afraid of emotional charge, men who can tolerate uncertainty without trying to control it, men who don't collapse under the possibility of rejection. The so-called bad boy often has these traits accidentally, not because he's enlightened, but because he doesn't care enough to manage impressions. He has his own momentum, but you don't need to be careless or cruel to have that effect. You just need to stop fearing tension. This is where the concept of frame becomes critical. Frame is the internal reference point you operate from. It's whose reality dominates the interaction. When you're constantly adjusting yourself to keep her comfortable, you're operating inside her frame. Her reactions determine your behavior. Her approval becomes the metric. When you're grounded in your own frame, your behavior comes from your internal state. You're present, responsive, but not reactive. Tension tests frame. If you lose your frame at the first sign of resistance, attraction drops. Because frame stability signals internal authority. And internal authority is what creates polarity. Most men don't lose attraction because they say the wrong thing. They lose it because their frame collapses under pressure. They rush to fix, to explain, to reassure. I had to learn that not every moment needs to be resolved. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every disagreement needs to be softened. Some moments need to breathe. When you allow tension to exist without trying to control it, something interesting happens. The interaction becomes dynamic, alive. It can move forward or end honestly. And even when it ends cleanly. This was another difficult lesson. Allowing tension means accepting that some interactions will fail. Quickly, decisively, without closure. That scared me more than rejection itself. But over time, I noticed something strange. Even when interactions ended, I felt more intact, less depleted, less ashamed, because I hadn't abandoned myself to maintain them. That's the trade most men don't realize they're making. They sacrifice self-respect to avoid rejection, and the cost is attraction. Tension isn't cruelty, it's honesty. It's allowing difference to exist without smoothing it away. It's trusting that if something is real, it doesn't need to be managed into existence. The men who understand this don't chase tension. They don't create drama. They simply don't fear it. They let polarity do its work. And polarity only exists when two people are not trying to become one too quickly. This was the turning point for me. I stopped asking, how do I make her comfortable? I started asking, am I comfortable with myself in this moment? That question changes everything. Because when you're no longer trying to eliminate tension, you stop performing. You stop auditioning. You stop negotiating your presence. You become solid. And solidity is what attraction responds to, whether anyone admits it or not. Once I understood tension and frame, another misconception had to be dismantled. It's the one men cling to when everything else stops making sense. Women like bad boys. That idea is comforting because it's simple. It turns attraction into a moral failure instead of a psychological one. If women like bad men, then being ignored is proof of virtue. You weren't rejected, you were too good. That belief keeps men stuck. Women do not like bad men. They like men who have their own reality. Men whose lives do not reorganize themselves around female approval. Men who are not asking to be let in, but deciding whether someone belongs. The bad boy often has this quality by accident. Not because he's dangerous or disrespectful, but because he's self-contained. He doesn't seek permission. He doesn't manage impressions. He doesn't monitor reactions. He doesn't care. And carelessness looks like confidence when you're used to watching men perform. But caring less is not the same as being cruel. That's where many men go wrong. They hear this and think the solution is to be dismissive, arrogant, or emotionally unavailable. That's not strength. That's insecurity wearing armor. Real strength is having a frame that doesn't collapse when someone disagrees with you. Real confidence is being able to engage without needing the outcome. Real masculinity is knowing who you are without requiring validation. I learned this lesson in a way that surprised me. A few years ago, I met a woman who was objectively stunning. The kind of beauty that makes other men straighten their posture when she walks into a room. The kind that shifts the energy without effort. The old version of me would have been gone. Focused, strategizing, replaying conversations before they happened. Trying to be impressive without appearing eager. But something had changed. We were talking casually when she expressed an opinion I didn't agree with. It wasn't a big topic. Just a statement delivered with certainty, the way people speak when they're used to being agreed with. I felt the familiar polarity point appear. In the past, I would have softened, nodded, found a neutral middle ground, preserved harmony. Instead, I said calmly, "That's the dumbest thing I have heard today." And I spoke to my neighbor this morning who thinks birds are government surveillance drones. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile nervously. I didn't explain myself. I just said it and waited. She froze, not offended, surprised. Then she laughed, not politely, genuinely. And something shifted. For the first time in that interaction, she was engaged. Why? Because I wasn't trying to win her approval. I wasn't managing her comfort. I wasn't placing her on a pedestal. I was treating her like a normal human being whose opinions could be challenged. That moment taught me something essential. When you put a woman on a pedestal, you force her to look down on you. That's not philosophy. That's geometry. Respect cannot flow upward from a place of worship. It requires equality of stance. And without respect, attraction cannot exist. Not in a healthy form, not sustainably. Most men don't realize they're doing this. They think they're being romantic, attentive, appreciative. But what they're actually communicating is inferiority. Worship implies imbalance, and imbalance kills desire. This is why men who agree with everything a woman says are rarely seen as attractive. Agreement feels validating at first. Then it feels boring. Then it feels weak. Disagreement, when grounded, signals independence. It says, "I have my own mind. I don't need yours to approve of it." That doesn't mean arguing for the sake of arguing. It means not erasing yourself to be liked. I started noticing how often men avoided disagreement. How often they laughed at jokes they didn't find funny. How often they praised opinions they didn't respect. They thought they were building rapport. They were building resentment. And resentment leaks. You can't hide it forever. It shows up in passive behavior, in neediness, in subtle frustration. And women feel that shift long before men recognize it themselves. This brings us to another critical error men make. They think attraction is built by addition. Add more compliments, add more attention, add more dates, add more availability. They treat attraction like a scoreboard. If they accumulate enough points, something should happen. That's not how it works. Attraction is built by subtraction. Subtract your immediate availability. Subtract your predictability. Subtract your need to respond instantly. Subtract your urge to please. What remains is space. And space is where attraction grows. Think about your phone. If someone texts you and you know with absolute certainty that they will respond immediately, every time, how much value does that attention hold? Very little. Not because the person is worthless, but because scarcity creates focus and abundance creates indifference. Most men flood the interaction with supply while asking for nothing in return. They make themselves infinitely available and then wonder why their presence isn't valued. You don't become valuable by giving more. You become valuable by having a life that competes with the interaction. This doesn't mean ignoring people or playing games. It means being genuinely engaged in your own world. I had to learn this the hard way. When I first started applying these ideas, I overcorrected. I went from too agreeable to too indifferent, from too available to disappearing, from accommodating to unnecessarily confrontational. That phase was messy. But even then, something strange happened. Even my mistakes created more interest than my old perfection ever had. Because even when I miscalibrated, I was no longer invisible. I wasn't playing a role. I wasn't following a script. I was learning how to stand in my own frame and adjust from there. That's the difference most men miss. They think confidence is a performance, something you project, something you imitate. It's not. Confidence is the absence of need, and absence cannot be faked. Women have been reading male behavior since adolescence. They've seen every line, every trick, every performance. They can sense when a man is pretending not to care while caring deeply. Authenticity isn't about saying the right things. It's about internal alignment. When your words, actions, and emotional state point in the same direction, something settles in the interaction. There's no friction inside you, no internal negotiation. That stability is felt immediately. The bad boy myth survives because men don't understand what they're actually observing. They see outcome without understanding cause. They mistake indifference for dominance, recklessness for confidence. The truth is simpler and harder. Attraction responds to a man who is willing to lose the interaction rather than lose himself. Once you understand that you stop trying to impress, you stop auditioning, you stop managing, you show up, and whether it works or not, you leave intact. That's the beginning of real power. After I understood subtraction, another truth became unavoidable. The problem wasn't just what men were doing, it was what they were giving away. They were giving away leverage. Most men don't realize how quickly they surrender their position in an interaction. They offer attention freely. They respond instantly. They rearrange their schedules. They agree. They reassure. They make themselves predictable. They do all of this in the hope that consistency will be rewarded. It isn't. Consistency without boundaries communicates low internal value. It says your time is flexible, your attention is cheap, your presence is guaranteed, and what is guaranteed is rarely desired. This is where the pedestal problem reveals itself fully. When you place a woman above you, subtly or directly, you don't elevate her. You diminish yourself. You communicate that her approval matters more than your standards, that her interest determines your worth. Respect cannot grow in that environment. And without respect, attraction doesn't form. This isn't philosophy, it's biological. Attraction requires a perception of strength, not physical strength, psychological strength. The strength to stand alone without needing reinforcement. When you worship someone, you announce that you lack that strength. You announce that you need something from them to feel complete. Women feel this immediately, and it triggers distance. I had to face how often I did this without realizing it. How I treated women as prizes instead of people. How I evaluated myself based on their responses. How I stayed engaged long after my interest had faded simply because they were attractive. That behavior sends a clear message. I have no standards beyond how you look. And that's deeply unattractive. This is why attraction is subtraction, not addition. You don't create desire by offering more. You create it by having limits, by being selective, by being willing to walk away when something doesn't meet your standards. Most men don't walk away. They linger. They tolerate boredom, disrespect, disinterest, all in the hope that persistence will eventually pay off. It doesn't. Let me be direct. If you stay where you are not genuinely engaged, you communicate that you have nowhere else to be, that your time has no competing value, that your standards are flexible, and people respond to that accordingly. I experienced this shift clearly on a date that changed my understanding permanently. She was beautiful, the kind of woman other men noticed, the kind that draws attention without effort, the kind many men would tolerate anything to keep around. Halfway through the date, I realized something that surprised me. I was bored. She wasn't unkind. She wasn't rude. But there was no depth, no curiosity, no engagement beyond surface-level exchange. And instead of ignoring that feeling, instead of pushing through because she was attractive, I paid attention to it. So I said something I had never said before. I told her calmly that while she was very pretty, the conversation wasn't interesting to me. That I was going to leave and spend the rest of the evening doing something I actually enjoyed. And I left. No argument, no explanation, no apology. At the time, I didn't feel powerful. I felt uneasy. I felt exposed. I wondered if I had made a mistake. That night she called. The next day she called again. Then she texted. Then she suggested meeting again. The woman who had men chasing her for years was suddenly chasing the man who walked away. Not because of a tactic, not because of a trick, but because I had demonstrated something rare. I valued my time more than her beauty. That changes the entire dynamic. When a man is willing to leave, the interaction shifts. Because now there is risk. Now there is something that can be lost. Now attention has weight. This doesn't mean leaving to provoke a reaction. That would be manipulation. It means leaving because you genuinely choose yourself. Women can sense the difference. That moment clarified something fundamental. Attraction isn't about how much you give. It's about what you're willing to withhold. Your availability, your attention, your approval, not as punishment, as consequence. Most men believe attraction is built by chasing. In reality, it's built by discernment. This brings us to a crucial shift in perspective. Stop thinking about getting women. Start thinking about selecting women. When you're trying to get, every interaction feels like an audition. Every rejection feels like a failure. Your mood rises and falls with response. When you're selecting, rejection becomes information. She doesn't meet your standards, or you don't meet hers. Either way, nothing is lost. This shift changes your energy completely. You're no longer trying to convince. You're observing, evaluating, choosing. Most men have no real standards. Their only filter is physical attraction. And because of that, they tolerate everything else. They ignore incompatibility, disinterest, lack of depth, lack of respect, all because she's attractive. That behavior is desperate, and desperation repels. When you develop standards beyond appearance, how she communicates, how she treats people, how she handles disagreement, you stop chasing. You start filtering. And women feel that. They feel when a man is not impressed easily, when he is engaged but not invested prematurely, when he is present without being attached. This is what creates leverage. Leverage isn't manipulation. It's the natural result of having a full life, of having options, of having priorities that don't revolve around validation. Most men give that away the moment a pretty face appears. They abandon their schedule, their opinions, their center. And once you give it away, you can't demand respect. Respect is a response to behavior, not a request. The hardest part of this shift is emotional. It requires tolerating discomfort. It requires walking away from potential validation. It requires trusting that you are enough without being chosen. That's why most men don't do it. They prefer the illusion of effort to the risk of self-respect. But once you cross that threshold, something changes permanently. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop waiting to be picked. You stop chasing what doesn't choose you. And paradoxically, that's when attraction starts to find you. Not because you're doing more, because you're finally doing less of what never worked. Once you stop chasing, another uncomfortable topic surfaces. one that most men try to avoid because it exposes their confusion more than any other. The friend zone. Men talk about it like it's a place women send them against their will, like an unfair sentence handed down without warning. But the truth is simpler and harder. The friend zone is not something women do to men. It's something men build for themselves. It's where women place men they do not respect romantically. Not because those men are bad people, but because their behavior communicates neutrality instead of desire. You earn your place there by acting like a friend when you want to be a lover, by being agreeable instead of expressive, by being available instead of selective, by being emotionally supportive without sexual presence, by hiding your interest and calling it respect. It's not honesty. It's fear. I knew a man, let's call him Mike, who repeated this pattern perfectly. Every woman he liked became his friend. He listened to her problems, helped her move, answered her calls at all hours, gave advice about other men. He invested months of emotional labor without ever creating polarity. Then eventually, he would confess his feelings, usually in a dramatic moment fueled by frustration and hope. And he would be rejected every time. He never understood why. He was kind, reliable, supportive. He did everything right. No, he did everything safe. Attraction doesn't grow in safety. It grows in presence. Mike wasn't being rejected because he wasn't good enough. He was being rejected because he never showed up as a sexual confident man. He showed up as emotional infrastructure, like a brother, like a girlfriend, like a pet. And then he was shocked when she didn't see him as a lover. This is the lie men tell themselves. That if they wait long enough, if they prove themselves, if they earn enough trust, attraction will appear. It won't. Attraction does not grow over time without polarity. Time without polarity creates familiarity. Familiarity creates desexualization. If you want to be seen romantically, your intent must be clear from the beginning. Not through words, through energy, through behavior, through the way you hold yourself. This doesn't mean confessing feelings or making grand declarations. It means flirting, teasing, challenging, creating tension. It means not pretending you want friendship when you want intimacy. That pretense is dishonest, and women feel it. This is where men get defensive. They hear this and think it means being disrespectful or aggressive. It doesn't. It means being attractive first, nice second. Kindness is not the foundation of attraction. It's the supplement, the seasoning, not the main course. A man who leads with kindness without masculinity becomes invisible. A man who leads with masculinity and adds kindness becomes compelling. That balance is learnable. One of the simplest filters I ever learned changed everything for me. Before sending a message to a woman, ask yourself one question. Am I sending this to get a reaction from her, or am I sending this because it genuinely amuses me? If the answer is reaction, delete it. If the answer is amusement, send it. This single distinction exposes neediness instantly, and it forces honesty. Most men are communicating to manage perception, to secure interest, to reduce uncertainty. Very few are communicating from internal expression. That difference is everything. Another exercise is equally uncomfortable. Practice disagreeing, not for the sake of conflict, not to be difficult. But when you genuinely disagree, say it. Calmly, clearly, without justification. I don't see it that way. I disagree. That movie was terrible. You'll be shocked by what happens. Most men assume disagreement will kill attraction. In reality, respectful disagreement often increases it. because it signals spine, independence, frame. It shows you're not auditioning. I remember a moment that made this clear. A woman told me she believed strongly in astrology. The old version of me would have nodded and asked questions I didn't care about. Instead, I said, "Astrology is just racism for birthdays." She gasped, then laughed, then spent the next hour trying to convince me otherwise. We had an actual conversation, with energy, with engagement, with tension. Not because I was trying to provoke her, because I was being honest. This is what men don't understand about attraction. It responds to presence, not performance. You cannot fake this. Men try. They act indifferent while caring desperately. They imitate confidence while feeling hollow. They adopt lines and behaviors without changing their internal orientation. It doesn't work. Women have an authenticity detector that's been calibrated since adolescence. They can sense when a man is acting, when his behavior doesn't match his internal state. That mismatch creates discomfort. To change this, you have to become the man who doesn't need validation, not pretend to be him. And that requires building a life that stands on its own. This is where everything connects. Men who struggle with attraction are often trying to use women to fill a void of purpose, of direction, of excitement, of self-respect. Women feel that void immediately. It feels like pressure, like responsibility, like expectation. No one wants to be someone else's emotional oxygen. When your life is empty, you cling. When it's full, you choose. Men who are naturally attractive to women are not necessarily the best looking or the richest. They are almost always men who would be fine without women. They have work that engages them, friends who challenge them, goals that pull them forward, standards that mean something. Women are an addition to their lives, not the center. That orientation changes everything. You stop chasing. You stop proving. You stop performing. You show up as you are. And when you do that, the friend zone disappears. Because you're no longer offering friendship in place of desire. You're offering yourself honestly. And whether she accepts or not, you remain intact. That's the difference between men who stay stuck and men who move forward. One is trying to be chosen. The other is choosing. What I learned from all of this is uncomfortable, but it matters. The most dangerous moments in life don't arrive when things are falling apart. They arrive when everything looks fine and no one is paying attention to the quiet shifts inside. Identity, when left unexamined, can become a fragile structure. If it's built on things that time will inevitably take approval, attention, validation, then time doesn't just change you. It threatens you. And when people feel threatened, they don't choose wisely. They choose relief. They choose intensity. They choose behaviors that protect their ego instead of truths that protect their future. Real fulfillment doesn't come from being chosen over and over again. It comes from choosing yourself consistently. From building a life that still makes sense when applause fades, when attraction fluctuates, when certainty disappears. Desire dulls. Excitement passes. Validation runs out. That isn't failure. That's reality. And the people who build their lives around that reality grow steady instead of desperate. A meaningful life isn't one that constantly feels good. It's one that remains grounded when it doesn't. It's one where you don't abandon your standards to avoid being alone, and you don't betray your values to feel wanted. The strongest position you'll ever stand in is knowing that you can walk away and still be whole. If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Share what stood out or where you're watching from, and your local time. And if you value conversations that go deeper than surface-level advice, consider subscribing. Not for motivation, but for clarity.